The growth of the welfare state has been one of the most important phenomena during the last 100 years. In most countries, both developed and less developed ones. And second, there is a lot of controversy and confusion. And I'm going to present my view based on massive literature on this topic. These are the main issues. As always, one has to start with clarification, conceptual clarification, which is a requirement when one deals with social sciences. And there's a lot of conceptual confusion. So first, I found it useful to start with a broader concept than the welfare state and to call it welfare system. In every society, there were some risks, either unknown, like accidents, or known, if you are lucky, you age. And in every society, there have been some mechanisms or system to deal with this risk, and one can distinguish, I think, 5 types of mechanisms. One is family, either small nuclear family or large kin-based family, which provides to some extent protection or compensation. Then civil society, so not based on family ties, but on other organizations. This has been beautifully developing in 19th century in developed countries. I will come to that. The third is what is called welfare state, a system which is financed usually and to some extent provided by the state. The fourth, you have company-based. Large companies tend to offer welfare services. This was typical of socialist countries. So, besides the state, there were also companies which provided various welfare services. And finally, one should not forget that it's individual or market-based. You can insure or you can cope by working and savings. Now, as there are various combinations in every country and in every period, you have various combinations of these 5 systems. And as the modern tendency for the last 100 years was to expand welfare, one of them, which is the welfare system, and it has various consequences. Yes, please.
I understand about the company-based welfare system.
Yes.
What's the business model of a company that gives welfare services?
Various. You may have some philanthropically minded owners. It happened. Or the owners may think, or managers, that workers work better if they are offered certain, say, welfare services. I am not saying this is universal, but on the other hand, it's not infrequent. And some of the large companies are like welfare centers. Now I come to welfare state. Yes, please.
Which services would you consider welfare services?
I am coming to that. This is the second point. Now, never define institutional arrangements by their goals, proclaimed goals, because this is usually manipulation, including the name welfare system, because welfare sounds good. So many people tend to think it must be good if it sounds good. To avoid this trap, define institutional arrangements by the instruments. And in the case of welfare state, definition is simple, and we have a lot of data. And namely, welfare state depends on so-called social transfers. And social transfers are divided into 2. This is a standard in international statistics. There are transfers in kind, so what whatever it calls free, like free education or the free health services, it's not free, of course, because it's financed by taxes. And this is the first thing. And the second is transfers in cash, like pay-as-you-go pension systems or various social allowances. Both of these transfers are financed by taxes. So obviously, the larger are the transfers, the higher have to be the taxes. So increased taxes should be included as a part of the welfare state. And if you look across time, you see in every country a systematic increase in taxes. And in most cases, 100% of this increase in taxes has been caused by the increases in the welfare spending. Absolutely, 100%. Except for the war, when welfare spending is increases, but then it is reduced. So if you want to explain the growth of the fiscal state, you have to look at the welfare state. 100%, almost. Now, sometimes some people include under the heading of the welfare state so-called social regulations. For example, minimum wage, job protection. You may, it's just, I will going to focus first mostly on the social transfers, but I would add something later on the social regulations. Now, as you can see, there are many different welfare states. So the point is not to just bash welfare states as such, but to look what are the variations. So it requires some knowledge. And I think there are two main dimensions of a variable called welfare state. The first one is the size, measured by the overall spending, aggregate social spending, and the corresponding taxes. And the second one is the structure. And the structure, to some extent, is determined, the size is determined by structure to some extent. For example, if your pension system consists only or mostly of pay-as-you-go, which means it's financed by special taxes called contribution, it's usually very large. And there the welfare spending has to be large. One of the reasons why in Germany there's a large welfare spending is that the taxation is mostly, the pension system is mostly pay-as-you-go. If you socialize medicine, then it has to be large, especially given aging. So very much depends on the composition. These two components, if they are large, are sufficient to cause large welfare spending. This is why the reform in Chile was a revolutionary innovation, because it reduced very much one very important item of the welfare spending, which is pensions, very much. There's less success so far, to my knowledge, with replacing private arrangements in the health service, even though there are solutions. Solutions are very important, but they have to be introduced, which is political economy. I'm coming to that. So as I say, the size depends on some macro components, but there are also some other issues under the heading of the size, which are fiscally not so much important, but economically very important. And one issue is so-called social traps. Some bad welfare states are badly designed, so it does not pay for some people to work. And then you have to look on not only at the welfare spending, but also on the taxes. So what are social traps? For example, and this is true of less qualified people, if you move from welfare to work, you get nothing or very little. So marginal tax is very, very high. So understandably, people prefer to be on welfare and they got stuck. Or you may have situations where to move from less rewarding job to most rewarding job does not pay because the increases in marginal taxes are punitive. So many people. Not every welfare system is designed in such a that way, but many are. And then you may have, for example, a welfare system which is not extremely high, but many people are discouraged from working, like I think in Italy, as opposed to Sweden. Sweden, after reforms, has large welfare spending, but mostly tied to working. Now, yes? Pardon me?
Sweden is what?
Sweden is an example of a welfare state which is large in total, but has not very many traps, because welfare spending is tied to working. You have to work to some extent. Now, I have shown this yesterday, but let me repeat that there's a huge differentiation in the welfare spending across countries, weakly related to the per capita. So it's not true that there's a very strong tendency that if a country gets richer, it spends more, relatively speaking. It's a weak correlation only, but what matters the most is that at every level of per capita income, you have huge variation. So other factors are more important. And if you look at poorer countries in this diagram, you see that Ukraine spends a lot. It tends to reduce it now, but this is for 13, 14 recent data. And on the other hand, you have Georgia, also the former socialist, which has done radical reforms. Generally speaking, socialist system displayed a large welfare state. So this was one of the legacies. It was extremely difficult to reduce it because it tends to be popular. So what countries managed to reduce it in the drastic way? Those countries which suffered the civil war, like Georgia, because then there is a collapse. And if you have a good leader, then he tries not to rebuild the welfare state, but to strengthen market forces. But these are exceptions. So now there is a myth that there is no welfare state in the US. And even the Americans say we don't want to be Europe, but they are already Europe. So if you compare the ratio of social spending to GDP in US, you can see this somewhere. This is US. You see that's more than Canada, more than Australia, more than Switzerland. On top of that, in the US, you have various tax preferences, which serve as welfare, so it's even more. And very interesting outliers are these countries which got rich without increasing the welfare state. And this includes also Singapore, which pioneered or at least introduced health accounts. Something which has been proposed by I think, some Americans, but not introduced in the US because of resistance.
What did he introduce there?
Health accounts.
What is that?
So you save on special accounts, part of the income, like funded pensions. It's similar, and then you can save because you decide how do you use it. Yes.
These savings will have some kind of better terms that you.
There are some preferences. There are some preferences for this sort of savings, but it has to be whenever it was introduced to be better than socialist medicine. So I have further mentioned that there are some other structural issues which matter. I mentioned also an idea of Milton Friedman of universal basic income, which has to be differentiated from negative income tax. There's an error. There are two different proposals. And interestingly, there are proponents of the universal income. So meaning regardless whether you work or not, you get a certain amount, both on left and the right, whatever left and right means. Both on the liberal side and less liberal side. But there are various expectations and various motivations. So say more socialistic minded people think, well, people deserve to have money from other people called the state, regardless of what they do. While more liberal-minded people think that if a universal income is introduced, then one can dismantle a huge welfare bureaucracy and various hundreds of various social programs and have a very simple system.
I'm sorry.
The question is, yes.
Can we just go a little bit more into this? Because what the suggestion is to...
The idea of Milton Friedman was simple, that one should introduce a certain level of income to everybody, regardless of she or him works or not, more or less. And the hope was that this would make it possible to liquidate the traditional welfare state, which consists of hundreds of various programs, very complicated and huge bureaucracy. So far, to my knowledge, no country has introduced fully fledged. And what would be the questions? The question would be, just a second. Okay. The question would be how to avoid politicization. First, politicization would consist on trying to increase the level of minimum universal income to suit the masses. And the second one, how to prevent the rebuilding of special programs if there's a pressure. So just introducing this is not sufficient. You have to defend it as every innovation, every innovation. So this is what I just... and finally, I have mentioned two dimensions. First, size, as measured by the aggregate social spending as a percentage of GDP. And second, structure. That's the third, you have to finance. So, as I said, the larger is the social spending, the higher the taxes. Very, very simple. And then there is a question, what taxes? Because taxes are bad, but to a different extent. Most taxes harm the incentives to work or to save or invest, but again to a different extent, and there's a general agreement that the taxes on income are worse from the incentives point of view, that the taxes less on consumption. The best taxes are on property, real estate. But from the point of view of incentives, and incentives matter the most. Freedom plus incentives. So if you hurt incentives, then you hurt the people because you slow down economic growth. So you can summarize most of economics in two: extent of freedom, kind of incentives. And the worst kinds of incentives are pathological, perverse. So they discourage people from working and encourage to cheat, which is not only an economic issue, but also a moral issue. Okay, now, so there's a question of, it's completely obvious that if aggregate social spending increases, taxes have to be increased. So it's no point in bashing high taxes. Do something about spending. And one idea among some economists was that it would pay to introduce bad taxes to finance social spending, because people, as taxpayer, would feel the consequences and they would rebel against the social welfare. This was the strategy of starve the beast. But a prominent free market economist, William Niskanen, has shown this is not working. So you have to tackle the problem directly by addressing this growth of social spending and did not rely on substitutes. And by the way, countries differ in the structure of their taxes. And for example, Anglo-Saxon countries have a better tax structure with a heavy dominance of worse taxes from the point of view of incentives, which are direct taxes. In Sweden is better, more indirect taxation on consumption. In the former socialist countries it's even better. So we rely more on indirect taxation, value-added tax, etc. So from the incentives point of view, it's better. Yes?
You said, just to understand, that Anglo-Saxon countries, their taxes are worse, and as you go east, it becomes better? That's what you're saying?
Yes, there are many things which are better in the east than in the west. No, at least some of them, because we have drawn the conclusions. Yes, and it was obvious for ages that direct taxation is bad, it's worse from the incentive point of view than indirect taxation.
So, sorry.
Yes, please.
What you're suggesting, or what you think would be better or utopian, is to minimize the direct taxes for our salaries, for example, and to increase the tax for what we purchase. Yes?
Yes.
What we buy.
So you improve the structure if you reduce the relative weight of bad taxes and increase the relative weight of good taxes, or less of bad. Very simple. And there have been many proposals for that. For example, some ecological taxes on carbon tax would be better than various regulations. And they are not so detrimental to incentives. So it would pay, from incentives point of view, to increase taxes on carbon and to reduce direct taxation of income. But it's very difficult to introduce. Yes?
One of the claims is that the indirect taxation is considered regressive and the direct taxation is progressive. So how can we handle this? It's more efficient to take and to impose indirect taxation, that's for sure, and probably making more tax, but it's regressive.
That's true. So there's a trade-off, but if you care about progressivity, you care about taxing rich people more.
Rich people buy more, so they will be taxed more.
No, but
What's the point? No, just to explain. That's true that various combinations of taxes have different properties regarding taxes poorer and richer people. And indirect taxation tends to be regressive. Yes, that's true. Because, say, poorer people buy more food, and if food is taxed at the same rate as some other things, then poorer people pay more taxes. And if you care very much about taxing richer people more than poorer people as a percentage, then you would go for more direct taxes, but the price would be slowing down economic growth. And who pays the price for that? Poorer people. So I think if a country is poor and wants to grow, and in a poor country, poor people want to be richer, care about economic growth. And not about stagnant, stationary, and this redistribution, who gets more. And that's what is proper for especially poor countries. And what is characteristics? People think that after socialists, there are many people who are homo sovieticus. I mean, they tend only to think how much to get from the state, they are socialistic. But it is only socialist countries which introduce flat tax. You know, it's flat tax, one rate. Or even proportional tax, which means you have one rate without quota free of taxes. So this means that everybody, regardless of income, pays the same percentage of taxes. To my knowledge, no single Western country has introduced flat tax. We introduced almost a flat tax, but other countries, Russia, the Baltic countries, Georgia, Bulgaria, Hungary, all they have flat tax. So it turned out to be politically possible in the former socialist countries, but impossible so far in the Western countries. So where is this more homo sovieticus? But if you care very much about redistribution, then of course you tend to prefer taxes which are bad for economic growth. Okay. Now, coming to real, there is a lot of myth about welfare state, and for many people, welfare state is good by itself because it's got welfare. But of course, this is a fallacy because one has to look at reality. What are the welfare state in different, and on balance, welfare state tend to have better structure in developed countries than in less developed countries. Even though there are differences between, as I said, Italy on the one hand, or Greece and Sweden, say. But the real tragedy of welfare states exists in less developed countries, where they were introduced under the pressure of Western experts. So these are just examples taken from official literature. So welfare states in many poor countries tend to be regressive. So the rich get the more money than the poor. In Brazil, it's very regressive. They introduce huge pension privileges for public administration. And it became so popular and entrenched that they did not manage to get rid of that. Even under Lula, who was defender of the poor. So interest groups matter in real politics. So you see this. Many poor countries tend to prefer students and not basic education, which is very bad. And then these students, especially after philosophy or sociology, become Marxists, and they rebel and demand more state intervention. Many stories like that. Now you have examples again to prove, which shows this regressive nature, that the richest quantile of population had a much bigger share in the public spending in education and health than poor. Well, in say Bangladesh and India, many doctors are paid in the public service, but they do not come to work. The same goes for teachers. So poor farmers, peasants in India are paying for private education for their children, because in the public schools, in many of them, teachers do not come to teach. And some special programs which have been praised as very innovative turn out to be very ineffective. I mean, it's not saying all, but there are examples in Mexico. Almost everything bad is called good. So nice words cover bad programs. Like Mexico, National Solidarity Program. Now it turned out that it favored the rich, and if the same money was distributed randomly, the poor would gain more. And it was supposed to be targeted. Okay. not only regressive nature of many welfare states in less developed countries, but also strong social traps, disincentive to work. Like example in Africa. So people give up working if members of the family get money without work. Even in Chile, it was found. We found some examples. There are also some good practices. I don't want to create an impression that everything is bad. But generally speaking, was again in less developed countries, the structure and administration of welfare states is on average much worse than in the developed economies. Now about the growth. 100 years ago, or 150 years ago, there were welfare systems, but little welfare state. Yes? So these welfare systems consisted of families, communities, including religious communities, churches, voluntary mutual aid association. I like very much beautiful organizations which were called friendly societies. They were self-organized by the workers. So welfare state was small, other forms of welfare were relatively much larger, but then something started to happen. The growth of the welfare state. Now, many people tend to think that, or say that because welfare state was small, people were poor. But this is a fallacy, because people were poor because capitalists only started to work, 19th century. So there was another reason. Now, there are many discussions what was the beginning of the growth of the welfare state, and many people credit or blame Bismarck. You might remember of Bismarck. He was a powerful politician in Germany. He was an anti-socialist who tried to beat socialists by the socialist means. That's typical strategy. You take over the program of your opponent and became more popular, and he introduced probably the first pay-as-you-go system, pension system. But it was very prudent, because retirement age was set at 70, and most people died before. But then, once you introduce a system which can be manipulated by the politicians, it is manipulated by the politicians. Because you have political competition. And then the retirement age tended to be reduced, even if when people tended to live longer. Now, these are some diagrams which show you the growth. That's unbelievable. From the historical perspective, that during 100 years there was systematic growth of the welfare spending and correspondingly of taxation, with some few exceptions. Even though, as I said, at every income level there is huge differentiation. Now, and there are many discussions about the reasons, including fallacies. So one fallacy is that welfare state has been growing to combat poverty. But welfare state has been growing during times where there was fast economic growth, reducing poverty. So what were the links? I think when you have fast economic growth, plus favorable demographic structure, you have a lot of money to distribute. And there are no threats in the horizon. So there are always politicians who try to use it for political purposes. And there are some ideologists who provide false justifications, like poverty. Now Now there's a theory put forward by American economist Benjamin Friedman. He said that as people get richer, they are more likely to share. But they don't need to share through taxation. They could share voluntarily. Non-state welfare systems. So I think this is hugely exaggerated. Now you find many economists who say that the growth of the welfare state was an insurer, was a response to the failures of the insurance market. So they say you can insure certain risks. So this is why the welfare state has to respond. I think it's very one-sided because this does not explain the growth of the welfare state. But the level of these failures was constant, or even less, because you have new forms of insurance. So it cannot explain the dynamics. So, but this is very popular theory, which is false. And I think serves as a justification for the growth of welfarism. So these are not true explanations. I sketch something which I think to some extent may capture the main driving forces. Sorry. Now, and these driving forces are divided into two: the approximate first level explanation and deeper level explanation. At the first level explanations, you have some legislative changes, which of course are reflecting political actions. For example, if you introduce a program, you may increase its generosity. You introduce pay-as-you-go system and you reduce the retirement age. And in the short run, it is not affecting the public finance. In the longer run, it's very detrimental. And this has happened in many Western economies. You may relax eligibility criteria so that it becomes easy to be recognized as sick. I will come to that. So you have many more sick people. This is demoralization. Or you may introduce new programs or liquidate old programs, etc., etc. But below this, you have political economy. So it has to politicians who want to relax have to prevail in the public opinion, and they tended to prevail in many countries, even though we have examples of reforms, which I will come. Now, what is Baumol effect? Baumol was a great American economist who deserved the Nobel Prize, but he did not get it, because probably he was too free market. And among his contributions, there was one. He pointed out that various sectors differ in the productivity. So in less productive sectors, wages have to grow, and then the real costs of services increases. So, for example, in medicine, at least until now. And this is a source of increases, and in many welfare services, you have productivity which is slower than elsewhere, but wages have to increase. And you have increases in spending because of this is mostly because of health and education, transfers in kind. But below there are also some other. Demography is very important piece.
Can you try to please explain again? What did he explain about the healthcare? What was the problem?
The general finding is simple. Sectors differ in the productivity growth, mostly because of different possibilities to introduce technical change. It changes over time. So less productive sectors may become more productive with the introduction of new technology. And internet technology increases the productivity of many sectors which were regarded less productive before. But at least until recently, education services and health services were regarded as belonging to less productive, meaning productivity growth was less pronounced, but you still to pay the doctors. Even though their productivity is not increasing similarly to the growth of wages. So relative cost is increasing. So this is the mechanism, okay? And, health and education are two largest transfers in kind. So whenever they are large, you have the Baumol effect. Demography and social, you have different combination of these factors in different countries, but in most countries they operate. Now, if I wanted to summarize, I would say what were the reasons for the expansion until recently, because expansion has stopped. Political competition, offering free goods. Many people like what is called free. And this was present both in democracy and non-democracy. Dictators are afraid of the people, despite suppression, so they offer social services. But they hate freedoms. Now, during the expansion, the situation in the world economy was good, growth. There was a very good demographic situation, the increases in the number and share of younger people who financed the welfare state. Strong ideological pressure. Welfare state became a symbol of being progressive without looking at the structure. Very general discussion. Are you for or against? Without looking into the details. And finally, to some extent, I think it's asymmetry. It is easier to introduce new programs than to liquidate these programs. Ratchet effect. Now, to sum up the effects. The effects depends on the variables, which is on two variables. On the structure and size of the welfare state, and on the environment in which it operates. So if you have, as I said, period of economic growth, the consequences are not pronounced, but they occur later. And there are four kinds of consequences of the badly structured and overgrown levels. I'm not saying every level. It's small and well structured, it's okay. The problem is that most welfare states are too large and some of them are badly structured. So first, distortion of incentives, which I already mentioned, and weakening of two very important actions for growth: propensity to save, which is necessary to invest, finance investment, and propensity to work and to search for the job. And we have a very strong empirical research which shows that in some welfare states weaken this. Secondly, so there is a distorted behavior, say less people work, more people are on the dole. And then once it becomes massive, then people, and long term, then people who live on welfare spending lose their capacity to work, both motivation and skills. And this is a tragedy. And this is often transferred to the children. So you create a subculture in the society. In economics, we call it hysteresis. Very scientific, but it's simple. Third, once a certain behavior becomes pronounced, social norms tend to deteriorate. So more and more people accept something which is pathological. The work ethic weakens. The cohesion of family weakens, which is very bad, yes.
What do you mean? I understand the two first examples they said, but why do you think the families should, why do you think the morals should change? I understand people don't work, but beyond not going to work, why do you think other things change too?
Because some programs are very bad for the families.
Can you give an example?
Yes, in the US, programs which favored single mothers make it more acceptable to be a single mother. And it was found out. Remember, there was a President Clinton who was a Democrat, but he was a reasonable Democrat, and he tackled this problem together with conservative or Republican Congress by reducing the incentives to have single mother, not to have families. The tragedy of black Americans is largely caused by special programs. And this is again empirical, maybe not popular, because the ratio of employment among black Americans was as high in the 50s as among the white other populations. And there was no breakdown of the family. But it happened later with Great Society, etc., etc. So I am not saying every welfare state, I am saying the very destructive welfare state undermine family. And I think family is very important. Also for the growth, health, society, economic growth. Now this link between perversive behavior and erosion of social norm was pointed out by the great Swedish economist who observed what was mixing in Sweden. His name was Assar Lindbeck. He was chairing Nobel Committee for Economics. And finally, which is often overlooked, is that if welfare state expands, that it tends to crowd out non-welfare, other mechanism, non-state mechanism of providing welfare services. Many people assume that there's a vacuum. So if welfare state does not exist, people would be dying on the street. That's not true. They are statists. They think that only the state can solve social problems. This is the typical of Homo Sovieticus. If not for the state, you will die. But this is pretty widespread in many societies. And again, all this is empirical to some extent. This is just the analytical scheme. Now, what are the other consequences of some? I stress, I am not saying all welfare states, badly structured welfare states, which are many. For example, in many countries, who was the victim of structural unemployment? Like, example, in France, younger people and women. And a prominent role has been played what is called social regulations. For example, if everybody who has a job is heavily protected against dismissal, and what happened? Private companies are afraid of a risk of employing additional people who may be bad performer, and they tend to reduce employment or not to increase employment. But then, in response to that, there is a bad reaction, namely creating two-tier labor market, creating a second class of people who are not yet in the job, so they are young, and they don't have protection. And this was the case in Greece, Italy, Spain. Now, what happens if a company has two classes of employees, heavily protected and not protected, and you have a recession? Who is dismissed? Those without protection, which are young, and this explains an explosion of unemployment among young people, say in Spain. But this was not because of free market, but because of bad labor regulations. Once you introduce privileges, people defend. And most people had protection. So these are extremely dangerous and bad regulations. Okay, now misuse of social transfers. Everybody can be demoralized, or almost everybody. This is why perverse incentives are so bad. So one example, in Sweden they relaxed regulation regarding the access to sickness benefits, so there were new diseases. For example, the addiction to heavy metal music. Yes. So what happened? There was an explosion in sickness benefits. Now they have to reduce it later, and they did it. This is a fourth generation. You can demoralize even the Germans. They are humans in some. So there is an expression of the language, in the language, social betrug, social cheating. Now they reduce it. The important reforms in early 2000. But before, and finally a strong progression in taxes, which often accompanies welfare state spending, has some detrimental effects on incentives to work more. Okay, I speed it up. Now about crowding out. We have some empirical research. So until the expansion of the welfare state, there was a growth of beautiful voluntary organizations like friendly societies, and they were very much against welfare state. These were voluntary organizations of the workers, which also provided education. But once welfare state expanded, they were in decline. And you have also some very interesting research on the US. So what happens when you increase welfare spending, and what happens when you reduce welfare spending? When you increase, then non-state forms of welfare usually tend to decrease. And when you reduce, then you have more non-state welfare. A special tragedy happened again in the less developed countries. It was found out by the World Bank that formal welfare state mechanisms crowd out traditional ones. Then you have less of both. Right? So what to do? You have two levels. First, to know what to do, and then to push it through the socio-political system. The first is simple. There's a lot of innovative proposals. So if there is no reform, it is not because of the intellectual scarcity, but because of not sufficient mobilization. Always. There are very few cases where we don't know what to do in economics or society. So these are just examples of literature. For example, if pension system is overgrown, because it's mostly pay as you go, you have various options. The most radical one would be to introduce the Chilean system. But it's very difficult if you have already massive spending, because you would have to finance transition. Because you cannot deprive all the people of their pensions, which are financed by taxes. So it depends on initial situation. If you can't replace pay-as-you-go system with a funded system, you have to increase the retirement age. This is pure arithmetic, which tends to be difficult. On health, as I mentioned, there are very interesting US proposals, including health accounts, etc. But the true challenge, and let me say that there were reforms. I'm not saying it's impossible, but usually the situation has to become very serious. Or you have a very good leader, which is very good on communication and group. And civil association, especially those who want to defend freedom, should all the time work to prepare the groundwork in the society. So this is an example, you can read it. But the true challenge is not to know, because you can know what to do, but to organize support for every free market reforms. And there is no magic bullet. You have to organize, and one has to be very, very, very good on communication. And I found it personally that you have to be on the offensive. You don't need to be offensive, But you have to be on the offensive, unmasking absurdities, fallacies, and manipulation of the state of status, including welfare status, and there are a lot of them. And one thing which is very, very important is that to take away the high moral ground from them. They are pretending, or they think that they are defending, they are representing high moral ground. But they base their manipulation of their beliefs on slogans, of nice words. We defend the poor, we care about welfare, etc. And they disregard the consequences. And also philosophical assumptions. Why the state had to be responsible for everything. So you have to address these claims in a very skillful way, in a systematic public communication, and then from time to time you win. If you don't do that, you have to wait for the crisis. But even the crisis is not always leading to the proper solutions if many people think that there is not enough statism, so they tend to increase most wrong. In some cases, you have wrong conclusions from the crisis. Like the recent financial crisis has been interpreted by most economists as a proof that free markets are fragile. While the true reasons were various combinations of bad policies. So it's very important to try to introduce correct interpretations of various crises. Thank you very much.
I'd be happy if you can add more about Sweden, because in Israel, usually we like to talk, to give Sweden and the Norwegian countries there, like Norway and countries in that area, welfare states, good welfare states. If you can explain, you spoke about Sweden, you're doing stuff structurally different than other countries and they're better.
Mm-hmm.
And
yes, that's a very good question
if you can talk
about Sweden, because there's a lot of myths about Sweden. But there are some very good Swedish economists and think tanks who dismantle, try to dismantle Ratio Institute. It's a very good one, liberal, free market in Sweden. Now, what are the main facts? Sweden was very poor in the second half of 19th century, and there was mass migration from Sweden to the US. In Minnesota, there are many Swedish Americans. And then Sweden started to grow. Not because of welfare state, because it was non-existent, so very small, but because of free markets. It was a very free market economy in the rule of law. And that fueled economic growth and Swedish convergence to the richer countries. And this was going on in the 70s. In the 70s, Sweden has less social spending to GDP than most European countries. So they became rich because of free market system and the rule of law, and then ideology intervened in Swedish policies, especially on the social democrat side, and they introduced more and more welfare programs. They were very proud of what other people were saying, calling Swedish model. They discovered they have Swedish model. And in a small country, if you are called innovative Swedish, people are very proud of it. So they increased. There are various ideas how trade unions should govern the economy, fortunately not introduced. And then Sweden in the late 80s had a crisis. There's a crisis. The crisis was mostly due to the banking crisis, but to some extent also to this growth of the welfare state. And then there was a change in the government, and more liberally minded coalition, center-right, Moderata party came to power, and they introduced a very thorough program of reforms. As a result, if you want to look to the Swedish model, you have to look to France. I mean the total spending as a percentage of GDP, not to Sweden. Sweden has reformed very much they introduce an innovative pension system, which consists partly of a funded system. They are more liberal in the European sense than in the US and Britain, because they have voucher system. And private firms offer educational services. This is not allowed in Sweden. This is not allowed in Britain. And in the US, you have powerful trade union, teachers' unions who block this. The Swedish and more. They have been very conservative of fiscal policy. They lowered the budget. They introduced expenditures rule, which tend to limit spending. As a result, spending has been reduced from over 50% to some 45%, which is quite a lot, but still much lower than in France. And Swedish economy has expanded again. Now they have a surplus in the budget. So Sweden shows that it can reform in a liberal direction. Denmark has still 50% of spending to GDP, but like in Sweden, people are not discouraged from working. That's very important. So you do not discourage people. Norway is a special case. If you have a small country with lots of oil and gas, it's rather easy to finance than the rest of the welfare system. So whenever you analyze welfare states nowadays, rich countries, look at their dynamics. So how it started and why they have been growing. And they have been growing. If you are a poor country but introduce large welfare spending, you are not able to grow very fast. If you are already rich, you can afford certain follies. But why should you?
You made a distinction between taxes and social regulation. And
social relation? What do you mean?
There was one sheet like the
regulation, social regulation.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
And in Israel, I think there's like a problem that sometimes social regulations are kind of tax on citizens because let's take the agriculture. So instead of taking taxes and put a budget that will go to agriculture, we're just paying this by the government-led monopoles or cartels and subsidize, not subsidize like with budget, but just let them like let the prices higher by regulation. And I think it's a method that of the welfare system that doesn't let the people know how much money they spend in a direct, simple tax on what policy, because you can't have the data on how the welfare system works. So I want to ask, like, I think this distinction between social regulation and taxes is dangerous. In Israel, we use a lot of social regulation for transferring money from one group to another without knowing how much.
That's a good point, but distinction is important because there's a difference between limiting some of this freedom directed by prohibiting employers to dismiss lazy workers and outright taxation, but I agree that there are some tax-like regulations. And the other point which I think you made is correct, that all the monopolies are bad, but state monopolies are especially bad. So one has to try to dismantle public monopolies or state monopolies. Yes, please.
You previously discussed the abundance of philanthropic aid institutions that existed before the welfare state. And I assume you could say that if there was less of a welfare state, then there would be more of those aid institutions.
Mm-hmm.
But I was wondering that I assume most of those institutions were operated by women who were employed. And given that today a lot more women are employed, would it be realistic to go back to that?
It's a question of proportions. I'm not saying that it's possible or easy to totally replace. But I've been showing it that the growth of welfare states has tended to crowd out what already exists, but there's a potential for resurgence. And what proportions emerge would depend on the reduction in the welfare state. So you have to reduce, because then you reduce the crowding out. To let other forms of welfare assistance emerge.
So you don't think that because a lot more people are employed today, there will be less people to operate?
But I am not saying that only family, even though family is extremely important. It's a welfare system. You may have very civil associations, like friendly societies in the past, which tend to, this was a self-help, yet it worked. And it was reducing in importance not because it was bad, but because it was crowding out.
You said that indirect taxes are more
President.
You said that indirect taxes are more favorable than direct taxes because they give more incentives to work.
So they did weaker incentive less.
Yes. So in the introduction to macroeconomics, we learned that the opposite, that direct taxes are more favorable because they less distort the prices mechanism. Indirect taxes distorts the consumer's purchase choices. What do you say about that?
I wonder what macroeconomic books are you reading. So show me later.
But indirect taxes don't distort the prices mechanism?
No, if you have uniform rates, if you have differentiated rates, then you have distortion of the relative prices. But if you have uniform rates, you don't have such an effect, first. But second, one has to care first of all about incentives, to work and to save. This is absolutely elemental. You know, until 20th century, 19th century, income taxes were nobody thought that income tax should be introduced. Because it was thought, according to their prevailing philosophy, that it's against economic freedom. Then the norms have changed. And then progressive income taxes. Yes, please.
What do you think universal income will do an incentive? I mean, there are a lot of issues, like people will be more prone to open businesses because they will be able to take a risk because they're insuring universal income. And on the other hand, you can think people will never want to go to work because they have a universal income. So is there like some work which
Since we don't have empirical experience on that, we can some speculate, and obviously this will depend on the level. And then the potential problem would be to what extent politicians will try to compete by increasing the levels. Like they tend to increase various social benefits. And this would depend part on political culture. Well, I am perhaps a bit more conservative. I think that the people should not be discouraged from working. This would discourage people from working, some people from working. I think that it is not only important for society, it's important for the respective individuals. But one should try to, modern economy, I think, supplies more and more interesting jobs. So working is not only a torture, maybe a pleasure. And the best kinds of individuals for society are workaholics. They do not distinguish between hobby and working. So the more workaholics we have, the better for society and for workaholics. Thank you.